Welcome everyone. My name is Gazdar, and today I am in conversation with Dr. Nida Kirmani. Nida is an Associate Professor of Sociology at the Mushtaq Gurmani School of I'll start again. Hello everyone. My name is Gazdar. I'm in conversation today with Dr. Nida Kirmani. Nida is an Associate Professor of Sociology in the Mushtaq Ahmad Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. She is also Faculty Director of the Saida Waheed Gender Initiative. She has published widely on issues related to gender, Islam, women's movements, development, and urban studies in India and Pakistan. So she is actually one of the very few scholars we have who has done substantive work both in India and in Pakistan and in very interesting and complex urban settings. Her book, Questioning the Muslim Woman, Identity and Insecurity in an Urban Indian Locality, was published in 2013 by Routledge, and her current research focuses on urban violence, gender and insecurity, mostly focused on the old Karachi area of Lyari. So with that, we'll start this conversation. Hello, Nida. It's so good to have you here.
Hi, Haris. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me. It's an honor.
So, Nida, I want to basically start by asking you a little bit about your work in the South Asian urban setting. I know that you're one of the foremost sociologists, urban sociologists particularly, that we have. And I first came across your work with respect to an area in Delhi. I think it is called Zakir Nagar, a lower middle class, mostly Muslim locality. And you work on Muslim community, the Muslim identity, and then particularly on being a Muslim woman in that context. So I want to basically kick off by a question about that. So you looked at politically and socially marginalized community, which is marginalized by the virtue of being a religious minority. So people talk a lot about Muslims in India, and then people generally talk a lot about Muslim women. And in your work, I found very fascinating insights into this double-edged marginality, being a Muslim woman in a Muslim community in India. So can you tell us a little bit more about this work in Zakir Nagar? What led you there? And what of it did you carry with you when you then started working in Karachi?
Thanks, Haris. Thank you for remembering that work. I think बहुत लोगों को पता नहीं है कि मैंने इंडिया पे रिसर्च की थी, and that is where I kind of began my academic career. तो Zakir Nagar पे जो research थी, that was my PhD research. So that was conducted between 2004 and 2005, and the PhD was finished in 2007. So it's been a little while. But of course, a lot of the issues that I was focusing on or that I raised in my thesis and then in my book that came out in 2013 are still very much relevant today, or maybe even more so since Modi came into power. So what led me there was, I think, as a student, I grew up, as you know, maybe others don't know that I grew up in the United States, and both of my parents are originally from Lucknow. And so I had these kind of roots in India. My father then shifted after partition when he was a toddler. So I had one foot, at least in terms of my family background, on both sides of the border. So I always had an interest in both countries. But for whatever reason, after my undergraduate degree, I ended up in Delhi working for a human rights organization. And at that point, I wanted to be work for NGOs or become some kind of a human rights activist, maybe a lawyer working for human rights. So that's when I began my kind of love affair with India and my fascination as well with the situation of Muslims in India, probably because of my own personal roots there. So जब PhD करने का time आया, तो that is the subject that I was drawn to, and often you're drawn to things that you have some kind of a personal interest in or connection to. So it was kind of a search, as many of us are on when we're students, in terms of our identities, but also intellectually, it also fascinated me. What is the experience of women who are doubly, in one way, marginalized? And so I started exploring this area, Zakir Nagar, which I found very interesting, which is in South Delhi. And it's, as you mentioned, mixed in terms of class background. So you have not super elite people living there, but middle class, mostly middle class, then folks who are lower middle class, which is Zakir Nagar. Ke saath hi, there's a kind of a slum. So a lot of the people living there are also majority Muslim, who are working in the homes of the middle class people in Zakir Nagar. So it provided me with this kind of multi-class space, and it was also multi-ethnic, because Delhi, like Karachi, is a very multi-ethnic city. So folks had come from all over, especially northern India, but also you had some folks from South India as well, and East India. So it gave me this kind of very diverse field site where I could explore the question of what religious identity means, and alongside gender, how do those two kind of categories work together in the lives of Muslim women. And it became, and the book's title is also Questioning the Muslim Woman, it became a book about questioning that kind of homogenous, that category that's often presented as a homogenous category, and trying to unpack that and really get inside of it to figure out what factors are, what these multiple forms of stratification mean in women's lives. So it was really complicating the idea of Muslim women as a homogenous group. And that's how they had been written about, for the most part, in the literature on Muslim women in India.
Thanks. And one of the most interesting insights from that work, which I think then carries over to your work in Lyari. We'll talk a little more about how you started becoming interested in Lyari. But one of the most interesting insights, one of the interesting things that I thought was new to me, was how you were understanding the agency of women. So you have people who are twice marginalized, virtue of their identity, and I guess the neighborhood also. And you must have kept up with what's happened in India recently. So it's quite possible that Zakir Nagar might have been in the middle of the protest movement. And then women, and then their issues of both safety but also their agency. Now, moving on to when you started working in Karachi and particularly on Lyari, I want to ask you firstly as to what drew you to Lyari. Why did you start to work there? And then one facet of your work that I found most interesting and very, very insightful was the lens that you brought on the experiences of the women of Lyari. And particularly, there's a piece of yours which talks about fun, and I think in a very lived experience kind of way. So can we start? Can you tell us a little bit more about how you got into Lyari, how you got into that space, and your interaction with the men and women and the young people there?
Sure. So that after I finished my PhD, I moved to the UK, and I was living there working as a research fellow for some years. So us waqt I was working on both India and Pakistan, but sitting in the UK, so kind of from a distance, I wasn't able to do any kind of in-depth field work. And as you know, I never lived in Pakistan until I moved in 2011. So I moved in 2011, and I joined LUMS as an assistant professor at that time. And Karachi was always where my family lived. My parents lived, not always, they moved in 2003, I think. So they were based in Karachi, but my experience of Karachi had always been, like many folks who grow up in the diaspora, just coming back, seeing your family, staying in whatever part of the city they live in, and my family lives in DHA. So that is very close to T2F, actually. And so mera pura jo Karachi ka experience had was very, very limited. And the folks that I was interacting with were just people from my own family. So I had no sense of the richness and the diversity of the city itself. So when I moved in 2011, उस वक्त I hadn't even thought कि मैं कराची में कोई काम करूँगी या research करूँगी. I had done the work in India, then I had worked a little bit on women's movement in Pakistan. I looked at some activism and NGOs, उस तरह का काम था. But I hadn't thought कि मैं कोई यहाँ भी ethnographic काम करूँगी जिस तरह से मैंने India में किया था. And a friend of ours, Dr. Laurent Gayer, he was visiting in 2012 and he was staying with us in Karachi. And he and I had always talked about doing some kind of collaborative research in Karachi. So वो अपनी किताब के लिए research कर रहे थे, the ordered disorder and the struggle for the city. And one of his chapters is on Lyari. And he was going there to do some field work. And he said, why don't you just come along? So I thought, this is a great opportunity. Why not? And I hadn't grown up hearing Lyari's name. I had no kind of really real imagination of the place, except for sarsari taur pe jis tarah se aapko pata hai ki this is a no-go area, this is a dangerous part of the city. That was about it. And this was 2012. So wahan halat bhi itne achhe nahi the. So I remember my family also being concerned that I was going there and whatever. So of course, with my personality, that made me want to go even more. So I was very curious, what is this place and why are people so frightened by it? So Laurent ke saath mein gayi, and there was a focus group discussion at this NGO called ARM. And lots of young people were there and everyone was very, very generous in terms of sharing their stories and telling us about their experience in Karachi. And a lot of the things they were talking about were things that I had heard in my own research in Delhi, which was surprising to me because, of course, I was looking at religion and religious marginalization in Delhi. And in Karachi, certainly marginalization, religion affects one's experience of the city, definitely, but not so much in Lyari as a whole. The issue in Lyari wasn't really an issue of religious marginalization. But there was a question of, there was this sense of stigma that people felt living in this place. And so a lot of the things that I heard about Zakir Nagar, 8-9 years earlier, I was hearing in Lyari as well, about feeling stigmatized in the city, feeling angry and frustrated that the rest of Karachi was looking at this part of the city as a kind of no-go area. There was a sense of fear around Lyari, and especially the young people there really felt it, and they felt really angry, upset, hurt by that. And so I think that's when I really started being fascinated with this place. In retrospect, and we can talk about this later on, I think Lyari then became quite a hot topic for a variety of different reasons. And I of course, I have no regrets for doing research there, but sometimes I think maybe, one could have looked at another part of the city that wasn't so infamous or wasn't so, didn't have this kind of, sensationalized reputation. But at the same time, I've had a wonderful experience there and I've learned so much in the 2012, 8 saal ho gaye. It's in the 8 years that I've had a relationship with this place. And it's great because it's gotten me out of the bubble that I had been in before in DHA with my family and given me the opportunity to meet people from so many different backgrounds as well. Because Lyari, as you know, is one of the most multi-ethnic parts of the city as well.
In some ways, we'll talk a little bit about how some of the hazards of doing this kind of work. Some of the non-conventional hazards. Of course, the conventional ones are the ones that your family and your relatives talk, and your friends tell you about. That you'll get mugged or attacked or whatever. The non-conventional ones. There is, as you know, soon after you started working there, Lyari did become a popular trope, I guess, for all kinds of things. So it has to carry that kind of a burden. And it's a place that fascinates people for multiple reasons, not just because of at that moment there's a moment of violence of so-called gangs, but also the ethnic mix, the racial mix, of course, and its class character, then its political history, and then of course the way in which triggers the imagination of everybody else around it. So how, I mean, what kind of safeguards, if you like, does an ethnographer have to take to make sure that he or she also does not start contributing to that exoticization? I know that your relationship with the people of Lyari, the communities, the individuals is very rich, and maybe that's where I want to draw you. But what are the safeguards and what are the hazards for a researcher in a situation like that?
So yeah, apart from the literal hazards that people, like you said, often think about, how did you go there? Kis tarah se aapne manage kiya ye wo. That actually wasn't. I was really lucky. I never had. I never found it particularly frightening or difficult. And friends there also helped me navigate the space when things were particularly bad. So ek to saal tak halat kafi kharab the. To not knowing which times to go, knowing which areas were particularly troubled. Lyari is maybe space-wise not that big, but very dense. And as you know, there's so many different neighborhoods, and it's talked about as a whole, but it's actually like many different worlds in one big world. So you can be in one part of Lyari and not really know what's happening in the other part. At all, or be affected by it. So those kinds of hazards were relatively easy to manage. I think in both projects, whether it's the Muslim Women in Delhi project or in the Lyari project, there was this contradiction in my own work this tension of questioning a kind of homogeneous, simplistic classification of a place, whether it's a classification of a group like Muslim women or of a place like Lyari, but also by doing that, somehow also contributing to that exoticization of that particular category or place. So with Muslim women in India, the irony was I was deconstructing or trying to deconstruct that category through my work. But what ended up happening after that was I became a Muslim women specialist. So then I was invited to participate in conferences on Muslim women, or speak about Muslim women, or write in edited volumes about Muslim women. And as a young academic, you say yes to everything as well because you have to. So you don't have the luxury to say, nay, I don't want to participate in this kind of. So you go in and you deconstruct in that space as well, and you go into your conferences and you question in those places too. But what you're doing is you're also somehow contributing to that exoticization, no matter how much you're resisting it in your work. So that's actually one of the reasons when I came to Pakistan, I thought Muslim women as a category when you're sitting in Pakistan, it doesn't really make sense here to study Muslim women because, 98% of the women in Pakistan are Muslim women in some way, or whatever the number is, but it's the vast majority. So that category stopped making sense. And so I also, unless I went to the UK or the US or abroad, whatever, I was not a Muslim women specialist here. I mean, it's kind of irrelevant. So that was a great opportunity for me to actually think about, working outside of these confines of these Western, like Orientalist categories that we're always fighting against when you're sitting in the academy in the UK or the US. And so when I came to Lyari, that's actually, I thought, wow, I don't have to work on Muslims anymore. And that's great. Like this provides me with, a new intellectual challenge and an opportunity to explore different forms of stratification. But the irony was that I ended up then studying this place that had already been in many ways overdetermined, even before the violence of the 2010s. Lyari already had a place and it had transformed from being maybe this working class area with a rich political history to becoming this place where Remandicate was and where gang wars were taking place during the early 2000s. So I stepped into this place that already had these kinds of stereotypes attached to it. And even though in my work I was resisting it or trying to, and sometimes I read the earlier things that I wrote and I feel like I very much contributed in my own work to that as well. So I feel that, I kind of feel in some ways guilty for that as well. But as much as I now try to resist, it also feeds into the kind of exoticization that you mentioned, these tropes that are associated with Lyari. So whether it's people resisting the idea that this is a criminal area or no-go area, then there's the other side, which is kind of celebrating Lyari as this like amazing place where football and boxing and is happening, and people are doing, leva, and there's, the Shidi community, and there's a lot, oftentimes focusing on those people who have African roots, and we know that they come from very diverse backgrounds, but there's this kind of fascination for outsiders looking into Lyari with these particular tropes. And so it's been difficult to both resist that, but also to understand what kind of impact those kinds of categorizations or exoticizations actually do have on the people who are living in this very diverse, very complicated place.
Your essay on, which is basically around the idea of fun, and I'm not sure it's there's a very solid feminist framing in that. And what I found a very insightful and very enjoyable account to read. Actually, the paper was actually fun to read too. This in one of the central, if you like, the data points in that paper is a picnic that you went to with a number of young women from Lyari. Fun has been both theorized and empiricized in the Karachi context and also in the context of violence in many different ways. I found your understanding of it to be light and natural. So I'm not using social science terms, but I'm using words which, so I think that the way that you have used fun is probably much closer to our intuitive understanding of what fun would be. Can you tell us a little bit more about the richness of people's lives, the richness of women's lives, and how that should come into, or that can come into, the analysis of problems that otherwise look very, very serious and very, 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 very dark?
Yeah, so I think that paper came after 4 or 5 years of working on violence. And after 4 or 5 years of working on violence, fear, insecurity, these things that I had also looked at in the context of my Delhi research, I personally got a little fed up with talking about these really dark and depressing concepts or experiences. And I also, from my experience of being in Lyari, felt like the work that I was doing wasn't representing what I was experiencing. So, because as a researcher, as you know, when you go into any space, you're just trying to look at one question or set of questions. And you have to block out all of those other activities or experiences or feelings that are taking place around you, even as a researcher. So when you only interview people about certain things, you only make notes about certain things, and you have to then silence all of those other aspects of social life that actually color people's everyday lived experiences. So you end up in many ways as a researcher, no matter what you do, because of the nature of research, essentializing people's lives. And in some ways also a bit objectifying them in some way by making them just be victims of violence or people who are resisting violence, people who are protesting, or people who have agency. But it's always about, that one aspect of their human experience that you're looking at. And so I think I started, this paper wasn't, and thank you for saying it was fun to read. It's academic work is rarely fun to read, and it's rarely fun to write. But for me, it was fun to think about what parts of life I was not able to talk about in my previous work. And so I could have written this paper about any place, really. I mean, it didn't have to be about Lyari. Lyari is great, but it's probably not more fun than other parts of Karachi as well. Maybe a little bit more fun, but there's fun and enjoyment happening all over the city. But I think for me, this paper was an opportunity to really look at those parts of my experience in Lyari that I hadn't been able to talk about in the work that I'd done before. And the other part of that paper that was important for me was to, again, going back to this work on Muslim women in India, to really question and unpack this idea of women from the global South as perpetually victims of violence, perpetually victims of some kind of oppression, whether it's Muslim women in India or whether it's women living in a lower income settlement in Karachi. But the way we write and think about women is always these bichari aurtein, or these, exceptional heroes that emerge, and we try to, then we kind of glorify them as well, which is great, and important. But it also means that all of those, everyday experiences, both of resistance, of submission, of neither resistance nor submission, get glossed over. And you have these, this very kind of dichotomous, this binary of the heroic woman or the oppressed woman, and you don't have anything in between. But we know that most women, myself included, are not heroes or victims all the time. We're just women navigating the complexities of our lives. And so I think for me, this paper really allowed me to use fun and enjoyment as a way of talking about all of that complexity that women experience in their lives, and also looking at activism or resistance differently. So it's always, when you're talking about feminism, and the paper is called "Can Fun Be Feminist?" It's, you have an image when you say feminist. You think protest, Aurat March, rallies, signs, people, shouting slogans. Wonderful. All of that stuff is wonderful, and things that I participate in as well. But it's not, the only way in which women resist. And maybe the vast majority of the way that women resist the constraints in their lives is through these subtle, everyday forms of resistance. If we go to, James Scott's work. So these kind of everyday acts that women engage in that are, subtly pushing back all the time. And also to say that the pushing back can just be to enjoy themselves. It can just be because they want to have fun. It's not that they're, trying to break out of an oppressive situation and leave their families and start these independent lives. That happens too, but that's actually exceptional. What ends up happening is, in women's everyday lives, is these quiet ways that women are trying to find spaces for themselves to just, experience a little bit of respite and a little bit of freedom from, all of the kind of drudgery that women's everyday lives can be. So this paper really allowed me to do that.
I think when some of your early work in Lyari, and also some of the work around politics and violence, also it documents and tries to analyze one specific feature of Lyari that people talk about quite a lot, which is that in a lot of protests, women play a central role, or they're present in large numbers. Sometimes people say that this is orchestrated by other political parties or by, the local criminal gangs whenever they're influential. But you've also noted that there are times when there are very spontaneous movements, and then women are playing an important role in that. I want to basically ask you if you, because you actually drew a very interesting connection between Zakir Nagar and Lyari. So I want to take you back a little bit to Delhi, with now using this understanding of the Lyari women. Because your work in Zakir Nagar actually, the humanization of the Muslim woman experience there, in Zakir Nagar and maybe other parts of Delhi. Zakir Nagar is actually our lens on other parts of Delhi where Muslims live. There's still, what was missing there in terms of what we saw was an element of, or a big element of, collective action in the public space. And then Shaheen Bagh completely changed all of that, right? So the image that we now have of Delhi, of Muslims in Delhi and of Muslim women in Delhi. So the kind of the lasting image in my mind now of Delhi is actually Muslim women protesting for something that is very, very important, or something against something that's very important. When you look back at your experience and know what you now know from Lyari, How much of that could you anticipate in your own observations in Zakir Nagar?
Thanks, Haris. That's a really good question and something I haven't really thought about. I haven't been able to go back to India for 3 years because I used to have, as you know, a person of Indian origin card that was taken from me a few years ago when the situation between the two countries deteriorated. So I was watching the Shaheen Bagh protests as you were from afar and feeling so sad that I wasn't able to go and find out what's behind this. Where did this come from? Was there some kind of organized? I'm sure that there had been some pre-existing, some kind of network of women that were already probably active, who would, there was spontaneity, but kuch to ground hoga uske liye jiski wajah se ye auratein is tarah se nikli bahar. So I would love to be able to someday go back and find out what those conditions were that actually led to these protests, which were so inspiring for us to watch from afar. But to be honest, उस वक्त मुझे I wouldn't have guessed कि ये होगा. And of course, the women that I was speaking to were not these victims or oppressed, silent, oppressed women. My whole work was about undoing that kind of framing. But I didn't see that kind of potential of collective action. I mean, I didn't see any kind of organizations working, women's groups in that area. It seemed like people were, in some ways atomized. They were living their individual lives. And many of the women were talking about similar experiences or frustrations or fears about the rise of Hindutva in India at that time. And this was, like I said, 2004, 2005. So Manmohan Singh was the prime minister, Congress government P, and we know Congress has a lot of negative aspects as well, and has not been all fun and games for Muslims in India. But certainly we look back on that time in some ways nostalgically when we see what happened since then, what happened in the last since Modi rose to power on the national level. So Gujarat had happened at that time. So Gujarat was something that was very much at the forefront of people's imaginations and the way that they were narrating their experience of being Muslim women in Delhi at that time. But I didn't see that, 10, 14, 15 years later, that there would be this kind of very inspiring almost movement that we've seen in the last 2 years. So, but I did see the fears and the anxieties that might have been, the kind of fertile ground for this kind of protest to then take place in the next decade.
The situation where we are now, I mean, you've just mentioned something when we started speaking about Lyari, and you said the one of the common factors that you saw when you first went there, one of the ways of speaking that you picked up on that reminded you of Zakir Nagar was that this feeling of a locality, a neighborhood, saying that we are marginalized by the rest of the city. So we talked about as someone different, we talked about as someone who is a no-go area or some place where there is crime. And that stigma of belonging to a locality that suffers this kind of a narrative marginalization was a common factor between religious minority neighborhood in India and then a very old working class neighborhood in Pakistan, in Karachi. Today, when we look at what's happening around us with respect to the disease, there's a disease which is spreading, and there's a lot of talk, both amongst experts as well as the educated people amongst the elite, about neighborhoods being talked about in particular ways. That the disease is spreading from here and there, and can we go here and can we go there? Can people from one place go to the other? Can do you pick up in these conversations? I know that you started by saying that your own positionality has been quite important in shaping how you have thought about the city, and you're picking up these conversations both in a milieu and at LUMS and here. So can you see certain threads where a lot of Karachi and a lot of urban Pakistan would be talked about as Lyari has been talked about, And what are the, I mean, what do you see as thing as happening within those neighborhoods then, as a result of that?
So yeah, that's again something I haven't thought very carefully about. But certainly, what I've been hearing is this very, this expected refrain from the elite that the danger is more coming from low income or working class areas of the city. So this fear that the virus is somehow carried more by people who are poor or working class. I think I've seen that, at least from my limited experience being in defense in Lahore and being in defense in Karachi. And unfortunately, since the pandemic started, I have had to retreat back into the bubble. And I haven't been able to even go to Lyari since I've been in Karachi for the last month, which is really frustrating for me because I'm dying to go there and to see how that part of the city is actually coping with the pandemic, whether anything's changed or not. And so I can only hear from friends what's happening there. But I'm not able to go myself. And so, of course, this is a wrong impression, and the parts of the city like DHA and whether it's Lahore or Karachi or the more upscale areas of Islamabad have had the biggest outbreaks of COVID for a variety of different reasons. So this is not a virus that is anyway more that you're more susceptible to if you are from a lower income group. We know that people from in low income areas aren't able to practice social distancing in the same way as if you're sitting in a place like DHA. But we've also seen that in DHA, people are still having parties and people are still going out and meeting each other and going to the masjid and going to markets. And so they're very much picking up the virus as much as anyone from any other social class, or maybe even more so. And it'd be interesting later on, once this is over, if people study the kind of class dynamics of how this virus operated. But I do worry that this pandemic is going to only make the distances between the various parts of the city even more vast than they already were. And I know in some of my work, I talk about the fact that Lyari and DHA are very, very close to each other. And if there's no traffic, it can even take 10 to 15 minutes for me to drive there. But in people's imagination, it is hours away to some distant planet that oh my God, you go there. So what I worry about now is that even after this is over, those kinds of distances that had already been growing will just grow even more. I think that that's the case with all of our cities, and even people have been talking about this in the context of cities and the rest of the world. That this is only exacerbating the kind of inequalities and distances between the classes that had already been growing in the past decades.
Your work on Lyari, you work on Zakir Nagar, and then you have one very important facet in your life, which is that you're actually a social media star. You tweet and you have a big following, and your opinions are sought after, and you get into very interesting debates. How do you square up your very, very serious academic work with the demands of a social media presence? And I can see why you're in the social media and your contribution on that. But how do you square up the two very different moods that are required to operate in these two different kinds of spaces?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I probably it just happened, in the last 2 years, and that because you knew me from well before the social media thing took off. So I think really in the last year, 2 years, this Twitter thing has become a big deal. Facebook का था, लेकिन इतना ज़्यादा नहीं था जितना Twitter की presence है मेरी. And I've also been surprised by it and shocked, and I find it very strange that people want to follow a sociologist. And it's good that they do. I think that the reason I use that space so much is because I think it is a place where we can have different kinds of conversations that maybe we're not able to have in the mainstream media that aren't taking place. Like, for example, this most recent one about Neil Ferguson coming on the Think Fest and the question of decoloniality, and do we invite speakers who have apologist views about colonialism? Is that, question of, is this a free speech issue, or is this an issue of us giving space to people who have very racist or problematic views? So your debate bahut achhi thi. I mean, I really enjoyed it. And it wasn't just me who was participating. A lot of my colleagues then came in, not just from LUMS, but from other universities as well. So ek badi achhi intellectual discussion hui thi usme. But then sometimes it's like Twitter can also be very nasty. It can be very toxic. And so I've also, of course, experienced that as well. And it's hard to balance. I think I need to be a little bit more careful to not put so much of my time and energy into that space, because it provides you with some room to question, think, raise critical points. But itne characters mein aap kya kar sakte hain? Like complexity kitni aap usme capture kar sakte hain? So I think that's something that is definitely a limitation of the medium. And what I worry about is that also somehow limiting my capacity to think beyond the character limit of those tweets or the threads that you end up writing. So it's a very different way of writing, different way of communicating. And it can be fun because you can be more emotional, you can be very out with your political ideas, you can say things that maybe you don't have 10 sources to back you up, but you feel or know that they're true. And Pakistan mein itni sari cheezein hain that we feel and know are true from our experience, but maybe we're not able to provide 10 different references for that, either because of the lack of academic work on that subject or because of the way that our state operates. So it really provides me, at least, with a space to express those kinds of ideas without worrying about the APA format or the, all of putting everything in footnotes to be. So I think it's been good, but I think on the other hand, I have to be careful because you can end up wasting a lot of time and energy. It can take up your whole day, or especially if there's some big controversy going on, it's very hard not to pick up your phone and see ki abhi kya usme kya update hai, kya ho raha hai. You want to know all the time what's the trend, ab aaj kya trending hashtag hai, or wo kya hai, and then you can spend, as hours just trying to figure all that out. And then what happens to your academic publications? And I'm sure I can probably see a very direct relationship with how many journal articles I'm working on and how much time I'm putting into Twitter. So I think I need to also make space for both, because one can't forget that the importance of also that kind of academic or deep academic engagement. And so that's why I was really happy today when you wanted to talk to me, not just about one of my papers, but to talk about my work that I've done before, because I think bahut logon ko pata bhi nahi hai. A lot of people who follow me don't know even maybe that I'm a sociologist or that I have a PhD in something. They probably don't know कि मैंने India पे किताब लिखी है या मैंने लियारी पे काम किया है. अभी when I tweet about Lyari, a lot of anti-PPP people will immediately start jumping on my tweets, and it's clear that they have no idea that I ever have been there or wrote about this place. So it's nice that you've given me the opportunity to actually talk about these things that are so close to my heart. And I think Twitter also creates a persona of yourself is created, one that I'm not even aware what that looks like because I am me. But I think people don't, people rarely even Google to see, acha ye kaun hai, this person that I'm either attacking or somebody that I really look up to. But it's just the tweets that are now defining you. And I think I find that very, very limiting, and it's a bit of a strange experience as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a big struggle where, as you said, that you have to say something quickly, but the fact is that a lot of what you say and people like you say is based on a lot of thought over not just a few hours or a few weeks. It's basically a cumulative process of thinking seriously about issues for many, many years, decades, in fact. Right? And actually physically difficult work, because you go and live in those places and you actually work very closely with communities there. I wanted to ask with a question, which is basically how you see things in terms of how knowledge is created and used going forward. You have interaction, of course, with students. And I'm sure that a lot of students are inspired by your work to also do field work in parts of Pakistan. And also wanted you to reflect a little bit about your interactions with young people in Lyari. I know that you've worked very closely with them to organize festivals, to organize events, to help them make documentaries and so on. How important do you think is doing social science work, both by students and academics, but also at the level of the community? How important is it, and how feasible is it? How possible is it? And what has been your learning, both with respect to LUM students and then at the other end of the spectrum, with the young people in Lyari? Are there budding sociologists? Are there budding urban sociologists? Are there budding urban sociologists who may not even be able to work in English and yet have important things to contribute?
Thank you for that question, Haris. I think, of course, social science work is, we've both in many ways dedicated a large chunk of our lives to that. And because we probably feel very passionately about it. And so to be able to teach it is a great privilege. And the students at LUMS are wonderful, and we're very lucky that we get some of the best and brightest from around the country. But I think one problem or one constraint of teaching at an institution like LUMS is that you're only getting students from a particular kind of social background. And of course, scholarships पे भी students आते हैं और national outreach program भी है, and we have different ways of bringing students from different kinds of class backgrounds. लेकिन vast majority, or especially जो social science वाले students हैं, they end up being from the upper middle class, or sometimes the elite. And so that limits the kind of experiences that they bring to the classroom. You also, you're not challenged as a teacher, maybe in the ways that you might be in another kind of institution or in a public university. And so I know that professors in public universities have a very, very difficult time. And so I don't envy a lot of the things they have to deal with, but I do envy the diversity of the students that they're able to teach, because LUMS में इतनी diversity नहीं मिलती आपको. But we do have, a lot of students who go on to do PhDs. But वही होता है ना कि the kind of work that comes out is, of course, your background affects the kind of research you do and the way that you're able to write, and that's as true of myself as it is of anyone else. So you end up you only can write from your own perspective. So what you end up getting is more and more elite perspectives on the city, people like myself who go into lower income areas to study the other. Again, that's something that I am very conscious of now. Okay, why are we always studying certain groups as the other, or they're interesting? Why aren't the people living in DHA interesting? Why aren't we studying the elite? So I think that, those kinds of questions are things that I'm coming to now in the middle of my academic career, but I wish that earlier on I might have thought about those a little bit more carefully. So we bring those kinds of questions to our students in LUMS, but to internalize them, I think, takes a really long time. And sometimes it never happens. And so I think one of the reasons why, working with, I work with this young filmmaker, Dostan Baloj, who and we worked on a documentary on Janbaz Akhbar newspaper in Lyari, like a tabloid newspaper that was very popular, especially during the period of conflict. So Laurent and I wrote an academic paper on that, which I'm sure, I hope many people read, but it's a dense academic paper. So I think it probably also had a very limited reach. So this project of working with Dostan, and he really contributed a great deal to it. It wasn't just me giving him directions, but, I told him the idea of the paper, the academic paper, and he then took it forward and we worked together to produce a kind of document. I was the producer and he was the director of a documentary. And so that was a way of, Dostan doesn't have a PhD in sociology or even a social science background. And he's studying media studies right now. But it was a way of bringing other young people into producing some kind of a social science form of knowledge. So that's something that I want to do more now, is how can I work with people who maybe don't have any background in social sciences, but produce different kinds of resources beyond just academic papers that allow for people from different backgrounds with different perspectives to also contribute to what is our body of knowledge about that particular place. So I think that's been great, and I hope once the pandemic is over, I can keep doing that kind of work, because the young people in Lyari, and again, we don't want to romanticize Lyari, but I mean, of course, I'm partial to this part of the city. I've spent more time there, and it is. It is very, very vibrant and very politically very. People are very politically aware in a way that I'm not sure, and Hais, you might be able to tell me more because you have experiences of other parts of it. But I do have a sense in Lyari, maybe because of their experiences, maybe because of the conflicts that have gone on there. People are very politically astute, very politically aware, young people as well. So I've had amazing conversations with young folks there who have never taken a sociology class or a political science class, and it really doesn't matter. And they know far more than many of the students that I'm teaching at LUMS, no offense to them. But, because their life experience has provided that kind of richness of understanding. So, it's been wonderful. But I think, we need to think about social sciences beyond the disciplines and beyond the classroom, and certainly beyond if you're teaching in an elite institution like LUMS, how do you bring your, not just knowledge, it's not me going and teaching people, but how do you also learn from the experiences of people outside of these very enclosed spaces?
Thank you so much, Nida. It's fascinating and so enjoyable as ever. And stay safe and stay happy. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.